Okay, now we're recording. So one more time, everybody, welcome to the January 22nd meeting of SIG Apps. Eric, is your audio on? Thanks. We linked the itinerary into the chat window, and I guess we have enough attendance to go ahead and get started. So we have a couple of announcements to begin with. So there's a new category of maintainer for Helm, and this is going to be Helm Emeritus. So if you're familiar with a professor emeritus, it's like after a university, you do tenure track, you get full professor, you teach for a while, get lots of research grants, have a successful career, and then at the end of it, you become an emeritus professor. So you get to come back and lecture from time to time. You keep your status in the university, but you don't have to teach classes anymore. You don't have to publish or perish. You don't have to go chase research grants. So the kind of equivalent or analogous position in Helm is an emeritus core maintainer, which means you're probably not going to see these guys being as active in doing code reviews and in merging new features. But going forward, they're still going to maintain the status of maintainer and can get involved kind of at their choosing to continue to contribute. And we have our first three. So congratulations to Ville Akis, Miguel Martinez, and Stephen Harris. And another issue along the same vein, we are going to get two new Helm maintainers. One of whom is Matt Farina, so congratulations, Matt. And another is Nikhil Manchada, aka Slick Nick on GitHub. And congratulations, Nikhil. And I think that's, also Helm Summit. If you haven't registered yet and you're intending to go, it would be a good idea to register now. I'm definitely going. I know Matt's going to be there. I know a lot of people from SIG Apps have already planned to attend. And the more people who attend, the more opinions we get, the more input we get, the better. So if you're thinking of attending, please go ahead and register now. Okay, so now we have a couple of demos. Do we have Mika Hausler on the line?
Yeah, Micah is here.
Okay, Micah, sorry, didn't mean to mispronounce your name. Okay, so if you want to go ahead and get started with the Helm Value Store demo?
Yeah.
And is there a link to anything you'd like, any materials or?
I'll post it afterwards. Well, yeah, I'll actually drop that in the chat really quick.
Okay, sure.
All right, I posted the GitHub repo here for the server. And then, yeah, you want to make me presenter?
Yeah.
You should be able to click on the share screen button. Can you try it, or does it say you need permission?
Okay, yeah, we're good.
Okay.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'll give a little bit of context first. Helm Value Store is a plugin that we at Squid built probably a little over a year ago. We had the problem of using multiple Kubernetes clusters and having very similar charts to install, but with slightly different values, and needed a way to keep track of those values. And the link that I dropped in the chat was for Helm Value Store, which is kind of how we, it's a Helm plugin for keeping track of values for multiple clusters. And at first we had a CLI built all around this. So we basically assigned a unique ID just to generate a UID for a specific installation of a chart or specific release with the values associated with it. So if you had slightly different values in different, say, regions or whatever for different clusters, you could store those in a dynamic database or Google data store table. And it was all CLI-based. And for us, this worked pretty well, but it required access to the tiller server. So we had to bounce around on different VPNs to install, say, a chart version bump across a bunch of different clusters, which got fairly monotonous. And so we built a UI around it. I'm going to hand off to another engineer here, Ethan, to kind of demo that.
Yep. All right. Like you said, my name is Ethan Rogers. I work with Micah on our technical operations team. So managing values for us was kind of monotonous. We had to jump across different VPNs. Squid is a UI UX toolkit, and so we pretty much just used our own product to build out a UI to manage this stuff. So for us, we're storing chart releases in Dynamo, and a release is the chart and version and a specific set of values for a given identifier. So here in our UI, we're talking to Dynamo to get this information. This is just stable Jenkins from the main repo. We can edit and make changes to whatever chart version we want, whatever namespace the stuff is going in. And then over here on the right, you can see this values editor. So obviously everyone here is familiar with installing Helm charts. What we did with Helm Value Store, once we started figuring out where our pain points were, we were able to improve it. So instead of having to jump across a bunch of VPNs, we built a server with an API for installing a Helm chart into Helm Value Store. So the API just takes this unique identifier, and we put some authentication and authorization around that. And what we can do from our UI is we can actually just like apply a Helm chart, where previously our workflow was copy this to our clipboard, go connect to a VPN, and then do Helm Value Store install the unique ID. And so this UI is actually really great because we can, let's see, we've got, for instance, we've got Cube Lego here, and we run it in 4 different clusters. And so from this single UI, we can actually jump down and apply it in different instances of our Helm Value Store server in different clusters. So we don't have to jump across VPNs. We don't have to, keep track of unique IDs as we're doing that in our terminal. We can just do it all from right here in the UI. We can make edits to these things and roll those changes out. So here we've got this Jenkins demo that I was showing earlier. It's using stable Jenkins 0.13.0. And we've already kind of preset this up. These are the default values, right? These are the default values out of the chart. We could actually go ahead and install that chart directly in. Mike, I'll let you.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. We can go ahead and install that chart directly in our cluster, and then we can see that it's going ahead and
create an external
setting it up right now. So we've got an external load balancer. This is all just vanilla Helm charts. And
take some time for the DNS to load.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a high level. We're trying to keep it brief. If anybody has any questions, we could take those. All right, I think we're good.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, that was awesome. Okay, so we have another demo. Kubernetes. Gareth, are you around? So I'm not seeing Gareth on here. So okay, I guess we'll move on for right now, and if Gareth decides or chimes in later, we can do the demo then, or else move the demo to a future date. Okay, so we have a couple of discussion topics next. The first one is a KEP that I recently opened. So let me share my screen. Okay, can you guys see the?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right, so the KEP is basically proposing a specific API for application object that we're using inside of Kubernetes. The underlying motivation behind it is that if you look at something like this simple WordPress manifest, when you do kubectl, I think somebody's got a little bit of feedback. Okay, that's better, thanks. So the underlying motivation is that if you look at something like this WordPress manifest, right? You kubectl apply this and you'll turn up a bunch of headless services, a client service, well, load balance service, 2 stateful sets, and you'll get an instance of a running WordPress application. The kind of problem with that is that there's some semantics that are lost in creation there, right? Like the fact that this set of things actually aggregates into an application is really lost on the Kubernetes side. So there have been a couple of proposals about doing things like adding labels to objects in order to allow people, well, programs to try to detect what an application is, but there are a few drawbacks there. We can ask people by convention to use a standard set of labels, which in my opinion, I think we should anyway, but it really doesn't help things like server-side garbage collection. It doesn't allow UIs to have a standard way to select all the things that are in an application and display them cogently, be they graphical or command line UIs. There's no real way for kubectl to interact with that in a way that's consistent. And it's led people to develop their own CRDs. I mean, CoreOS Tectonic has some really awesome kind of beta level functionality for their own application CRD object that's out there right now. But if everyone is kind of doing this, why don't we just have the application as a first class object inside of the apps API so that we have a consistent way for everyone to interact with the same object? And when users create an application using Helm or Compose or kubectl apply, however they do it, we can have all the UIs interact in a similar way and have a uniform user experience across everybody's UI. Also, everyone doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. We can do things like add garbage collection, and we can do things like server-side validation that the application creation is valid. So to that end, this is the basic API, and I'm not going to go too far into depth with it just because it's rather large, and really to give useful feedback, the people will have to read the KEP. But the underlying idea is that we'd have a high-level application object that has status, has potentially a pod health check, and it's a standard Kubernetes API object with a spec and a status. And you can compose all of your application metadata in a single location in the API server, as opposed to having to append all of the information to every object in order to determine what application it comes from, what component it represents, and what license it has, who the maintainers are, what a description for it is. The basic functioning of it is to list the components by group, version, kind inside of the application metadata, and then add a selector that's able to select those components from an API standpoint, at least. So it might look something like this. So same WordPress application that we looked at above, but now we have this application object. The application object has a selector that selects all of the components of the WordPress application. The specific group, version, kinds of those components and how they're realized is made explicit in the component section. This lets any client know, okay, I can get this component from this GVK, use this label selector to do my list or my watch, and pull it back down. So it kind of, because there is a bulk API that allows you to do a generic watch, and there are individual client sets for the Go clients that allow you to pull down individual clients, exposing the GVK information of the created components along with the label selector is sufficient information for you to at least retrieve the component. From a UI perspective, there's still a lot of challenges around, like, if you say my application contains a deployment, that deployment also has replica sets, and those replica sets have pods. So there's an object hierarchy of ownership that's implied by Kubernetes APIs that we really don't address in this KEP at all. So UI designers are still going to have to display a deployment the way they know how to display it. Honestly, though, I mean, it's a challenge that every UI for Kubernetes has already faced and solved in some way. So we're not really introducing any new challenge for UI designers, but it's still an existing one that's not addressed. The other thing that the application API has is a notion of aggregation. So in the example above, there was one giant application that contains an RDBMS along with the web server. But that model of tenancy doesn't go for every application or every organization, right? Some people are going to have one team that maintains MySQL as a database. Maybe it's a highly available replicated version of MySQL, whatever, but it's a separate app from the application that the web server is, right? And maybe there's a tenancy model where multiple people are going to be dependent on this same app. So the application object also supports a notion of dependencies. So you can explicitly say that an app depends on another app. So in this example, you have an application called MySQL, which is one app that provides the database. Then you have a second app, which depends on MySQL, and that's WordPress. And that's just a way for designers to be able to, again, split apps and express dependencies between apps. The basic functionality that we want to end up providing via the controller, well, via the API, is being able to select applications and all their components, retrieve applications, get dependencies, provide for health checks. And from the server side, we'd like to implement garbage collection for application, cascading and non. So if you kubectl delete app, it would delete the app along with its components, but not its dependencies. If you kubectl delete app non-cascading, it would just delete the application object, but it wouldn't delete any of its dependencies. Because of the way it's designed, you could actually also add apps or application objects to existing components. So there's nothing that would stop you from creating an application object, appropriately labeling the components of the application object, having a label selector on the application object that selected a bunch of existing components, and composing a bunch of services, ingresses, and or pod containers like stateful sets and deployments into an application. And then the rest of the KEP is mainly about risks and mitigations, graduation criteria. That's kind of important to talk about. I mean, basically, if people in this SIG don't find this useful, then we definitely need to go back and have a conversation. And if we don't get adoption, then there's no point in going to beta. But the idea would be in 110, we'd like to start work on it and probably get it to an alpha level of stability. And then if it's useful, if people like it, after we've gotten enough feedback on it to move it forward, we'd like to move it to a beta phase after, sufficient tools start using it. Okay. So with that being said, I'd like to kind of open up the table to any thoughts that you guys have on the spec, or whether or not this is the right direction. Any questions?
Hi. So I'm just wondering, first of all, it's the notion of an application seems super useful. I mean, we have built some UI on top of Helm and Kubernetes, and we used some of the aggregations that you discussed. We implemented it ourselves. I'm just wondering about two things. First is, it seems that most of it can be achieved with labels, and you mentioned it yourself, and I think it's pretty common standard to label, use the label of app, and we found that this very simple label can meet most of the complexities around finding the components for an app. And the other consideration is there seemed to be some overlap with Helm in terms of the metadata dependencies and stuff. And just wondering how you see this, these two work together.
If the app object becomes standard, I'd like to, so first of all, I think it's compatible with Helm, and I don't think it's something you would do instead of Helm. It's something to enable developers of tools like Helm and Compose and other application designers to kind of have a higher level object that provides them some utility. So the idea wouldn't be to replace Helm, it's to provide a tool for Helm.
Yeah.
The interaction that I would see with Helm is that you would have, inside of your templates, you would add an application if you chose to do so into your manifest. The other thing is, this is kind of an opt-in, not an you must feature. It's a you may. So if we can get broad agreement as a community that something like this is useful and it helps UIs have a consistent experience, like the idea would be if I can, so the broad vision is I can Helm install an application and then I can kubectl get the application and it works. Or I can use, what's the, I forget the name of the tool, the case on it, yeah. So I can case on it, install an application, and then I can use Helm to update it or get it, right? Like the idea would be to provide a single object that lets all of the tools in the community speak the same language about applications, but not to replace any of them.
Yeah, and just to, I speak for the KSonnet team. Yeah, this is the exact same thing that we're thinking, and we think it's great to have this standardization.
So I just had a quick question. I think this looks really good. Thanks for showing it, and it's definitely the kind of thing that I know our group would use. But I'm curious, have you gotten any pushback from the wider community about? It seems like this abstraction kind of moves up the stack a little bit, like away from what a lot of the other things that Kubernetes has done. Like, do you think you'll get pushback about, we're abstracting too far up the stack in terms of collecting an application and a collection of objects for this to be included in the base of Kubernetes?
That remains to be seen, but I hope not. I mean, ultimately, we're SIG Apps, right? And we have an app group in the API. And if we think this is useful and it provides features for the tooling that are, so I mean, like the thing about what made an iPhone, not the great hardware, that was one thing. But ultimately it's the apps, right? So Kubernetes is probably going to be as useful as its apps. And if we want people to continue to developing apps and contributing to a rich ecosystem around it, we have to, meet the needs of those people, of those developers. If we want our users to have a consistent user experience across all of the Kubernetes deployments, including Tectonic, including canonical distribution, including AWS and Azure and GKE. And we want their apps to work in all those environments, and for them to be able to use their tools in all of those environments. We have to, in my mind, provide them some level of a consistent experience. And labels and conventions are sort of one way to do that, but ultimately a well-intentioned designer of a tool, by accidentally not meeting a particular convention that we've put out there and said you should do this, can break somebody else's tool or somebody else's user experience. So having consistency to me is important, just because it allows a user to go from environment to environment, from tool to tool, let every team choose the tools and environments they like, and everybody can have a good experience. At least that's the argument I intend to make. But I mean, you know,
it makes sense.
Yeah, we have to see if the community, I would say that, like, if everybody who works on the ecosystem is in favor of moving forward in this, and if we can address all of your feedback, that's a strong indication that that's just something we should do. If there's no interest in it, or if everyone says this is not useful, well, then we have to take that as feedback too, right?
I'll just jump in here. So one of the things at the App Dev Working Group, where folks from a number of SIGs have come together to discuss application compatibility and tooling compatibility to allow things to work together. One of the very first things that came up was a similar concept to this in the form of a CRD, and Antoine actually demoed that, I think, in the very first App Dev Working Group meeting to show that off. And so this idea has been a long-term discussion point over there, and one of the actions was to bring that kind of idea here. And it so happens that Ken was coming over with this, and we were looking at, well, when do we talk about a CRD on the agenda? And he was like, well, do we make it part of Apps V1? And so the conversation has kind of moved over here. How well it'll fit, as Ken said, we've still got to figure it out. But from others in the community, the concept has already been put out there in discussion and even demoed, so to speak.
And CoreOS is using this CRD in Tectonic right now to ship a feature for their clients called Tectonic Apps. So, I mean, we already have some people who are developing on top of it.
I mean, it definitely makes sense for me. Like I said, our group is doing something very similar with the apps that we're creating in terms of putting together, you know, our own custom labels and annotations to collect these things. I was just kind of curious about, you know, fitting into the ecosystem. But I think your rationale makes good sense to me, and, like, you know, I'll point our group at this. Hopefully, get some comments there. So thank you.
I would definitely. The one thing that the CAP lacks right now is feedback from the community, particularly from the tool designers, from Helm, from KSonnet, from CoreOS, from in particular, we're looking for maybe Anton to give some credit, because he's done a lot of work with these CRDs and getting the Tectonic feature out to market. So any lessons learned, or any, like, I mean, we put some fields in for a notion of what these are the things that are valuable or in application, for instance, but we're not convinced those are necessarily the right set of fields. So is there anything that should be in there? Is there anything that shouldn't be in there? The other thing is with and Anton, I think, is going to talk about this next, there's still value in having a standardization of labels across tools, even if we do this application. So maybe, and I think I tried to leverage some of the I guess the design document for common labels across applications anyway, but making sure that we capture that is probably important as well.
I'll also jump in here with a comment. This is really exciting. I'm looking forward to reading the CAP in detail. I think the notion of an application level health check is something that's really exciting, and this in particular is a really good way to do it. And I'm sure you're going to be talking about this at Helm Summit in the working group, right, Ken?
I didn't plan to give a talk at Helm Summit. Plan to more come and listen.
No, there'll be a working group about the future of Helm, so that'll be a good place to discuss this as well. But I just want to say thanks for that.
Oh, thank you. But definitely, I'll intend to attend the App Dev Working Group meeting that's, I believe, this Wednesday, and discuss further there and see if there's interest there as well. But primarily, I mean, you guys are the ultimate. You guys would be the consumers. You guys would be the users. You guys are driving the ecosystem that this is meant to support. So your feedback is like some of the most important.
I'll also point out real quick, as the next thing in the agenda is actually the labels that we've sort of been talking about. So that's in this meeting too, if we have time.
Yep. I think we still have about half an hour left. Anton, I mean, does anyone have anything else to say on this or any more questions on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that this is super interesting to me. I've been working on some Helm charts that have like a number of deployments, a number of stateful sets, and all the services and PVCs and everything, tie them together. And to have an extra layer where I can kind of describe them all together and kind of more how they function together and do that application level health check, as I guess it's almost like a meta application at that stage. That's like, this is all super exciting to me, and I wish I had it right now. So I'm super excited to see where it goes.
Cool, thanks.
Just a quick note from me as well. I think it is a fantastic idea, and the entity exists, so being able to represent it will bring value in, I think, way beyond what you guys originally thinking here. Ability to provide more metadata and then to interact with applications as objects, which allows just to move the operations at a higher level as well. So I think this is fantastic, and it will enable further things, but the initial goal, I think, is very admirable and very useful right away.
Awesome.
Okay, quick question. I think I joined late, but quickly, is there a proposal that you guys can share in the chat? And then is this proposal related to making this a core API in Kubernetes, or is this still based on CRDs?
Yes, no, it's related to making it a core API object. That's the entire kind of intention of it. And the proposal, the KEP is linked in the meeting minutes for today. So if you go down to the discussion, it's linked directly from there.
Right, and is this going to be discussed in this SIG apps, or is this a separate working group for this?
We should definitely engage the app definition working group. I brought it to SIG Apps first because SIG Apps is kind of where everybody who works on the ecosystem tooling tends to show up. So I thought it would be a great place to engage people who are working actively on Helm, who are working actively on Compose or KSonnet or any other type of tool that is using applications in the Kubernetes ecosystem. I mean, we're talking about an app object that would live in the apps group. SIG Apps seems to me were the best place to start with it. But the app dev working group is definitely another one. And I've talked to some of the leads of SIG CLI and the UI SIG as well. So
awesome. So I'll look at a proposal. I think we at Salesforce are also doing something similar internally, but obviously using CRDs. And so would love, like, we have a lot of feedback in those areas. So I'll look at the proposal. One last question. Is this not just API object, right? Obviously, it's going to be supported by an in-tree controller as well.
correct.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Ken, do you have any timelines where when you are planning to implement this? Given that today is a feature freeze for 1.10, I'm assuming that you're starting the discussion and this will be landing for 1.11, or are you actually interested in having something in place for 1.10?
We're interested in doing it in 1.10 and starting implementation in 1.10 and getting it to alpha in 1.10. There's a planned implementation history on the KEP. So we'd like to get potentially to beta by 1.11, provided we get adoption. And that's really the graduation criteria for going to beta as far as the KEP is concerned right now, right? So if everyone finds it useful and if people can start playing with it at an alpha level in 1.10 through 1.11, maybe by 1.11 we could take it to beta.
Okay, thanks.
It's also worth knowing for anybody who isn't familiar, the KEPs are the direction that Kubernetes is kind of going for major changes like this. It stands for Kubernetes Enhancement Proposal. and where there were features and some other things in the past, this is the direction that's being piloted for the new system. It was built around things like Rust and their system and Python PEPs to try to bring all of this stuff together that we have done in the past and be able to link off to stuff. So if you're wondering where in the proposal process and things sits, this is kind of being beta tested as a new system to kind of supersedes the past ones. It's being beta tested, so the process may change, but that's where this sits. And so eventually it'll get in front of others like SIG architecture and things like that as it continues to move along. But this is kind of the proposal process these days that we're trying.
Hey,
I mean, what? Sorry,
I was. Sorry, go ahead.
Was somebody trying to speak?
I think I interrupted someone, but my question was, where do we give feedback?
Oh, so it's open as a pull request on GitHub. So the link that's provided off of the meeting minutes will link you to the PR.
Okay.
And please give lots and lots of feedback, because if we're going to do this, we should make sure we ship the right thing, not just something.
Is CAPS only for major changes, or is this for small minor changes, like we used to do a proposal in the design, in the communities repo?
Anything you would do a design for, I think at this point you would probably want to do a CAP for. Most thing, if it doesn't require a design, if it's a small change or break fix or bug fix, then that wouldn't require a CAP. That's my understanding, at least. Caleb or Joe Beta or maybe Sarah would all be people that you might want to reach out to in terms of better understanding exactly what requires a CAP and what doesn't.
Is it basically just a document with a set of things that we must include in the document, or is it more than that?
I just dropped a link into chat here to the KEP area, and you'll actually see there's a little bit of documentation. There's a template KEP. There is some specific stuff like YAML front matter, because they want to build automation tools that can look at that and do things along with human readable text. But there's a whole bunch of information here, and if you still have a question, feel free to ask it as a question here, and maybe label it with SIG architecture, because they own the process, and folks like Joe and whoever else can go take a look at those.
And for one of the, for you guys, if you're interested in proposing CEPs and SIG apps, we opened up I just linked it, an actual place just for CEPs for SIG apps that you think this should be the only SIG for.
Sounds good. Yeah, thanks.
Cool. So we still have 20 minutes left. And Anton, are you on? Yeah, I see him.
Do you hear me?
Ah, there we go. Sure. Did you want to have a discussion on common labels and annotations for applications in Kubernetes?
Sure, and I think also Matt can jump in. So, yes, there is a document, a proposal about common label. We just link it here. So it's already been shared on the main list. One idea the main idea is like to get a consensus around a set of labels that the community should or could use. So it's a very simple case. It's good the name, the version, etc. So what's the most important value that mostly everyone is using? What kind of convention we can build on top? For example, some application do Kate-app, some others directly up, etc. So I just like to find the common way to define a set of labels. And by doing this, then we can surface and implement some behavior based. So as you said, maybe it's not like as solid as a API object, but some UI can say I'm going to look for the label application app.kubernetes.io name, etc. So that's the main point. Yeah,
so I shared my screen with the document. If anybody wants to look at it, what we're really looking at though is in the process. This came out of the application definition working group, and one of the things that we've got here is we're looking at the proposal for the names. We're discussing the different ins and outs of the characteristics, and we want to go now create a best practice document to put up on Kubernetes.io to go tell folks here is what they are, and then some folks can build things like validators across it. Like there is a demo I think that's going to be at the app dev working group that actually shows somebody can go inspect the different resources running in a cluster and see how they match up to what labels and annotations they've done here, right? So you can see who's doing it, who's not, have they done this. You could probably write something that inspects the documentation, maybe do a JSON spec or JSON schema that says what these could be, and then you could build tools on top of it. But once we have this, then you can start building automation and teach people that. And so we're kind of at the phase where we're trying to come up with what the base set will be and the descriptions of those, and then get that documented and a PR for the docs repo.
So yeah, if you have opinions, there is like some open question left. For example, the name should, if I take the example of WordPress, should it be WordPress or should it be MySQL? Like a component of WordPress, what the name should be in this case, etc. So there's still some open question, and I invite you to comment and give some opinion.
There's something some folks may want to call attention to. You'll notice that everything is namespaced, which I'll be honest is harder on UX. In fact, there's a discussion on that. And the reason the first pass didn't use namespaces on the labels, but we didn't feel it was appropriate to take over the global namespace either. And so that's where we went with a namespace. I don't think this would be accepted up if it just decided to come up with the names for the global namespace. In fact, the documentation and label and annotations says that if it doesn't have a namespace, it's expected to be private to the user. So users can kind of have that space to do what they want. And so we understand that it's a little more difficult on the UX, but that was intended to fit the style and the reasoning behind it. There's also, if you look on here, like if Helm or something else wanted to do, I use Helm as an example, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the case, how they could, other projects could use their own labels and annotations with a namespace as well. Just to give an example. But there's still debate going on in this document as we finally refine what should be in, what should be out, how should it be, should it be tier or component or layer or something else, right? How the nuance, naming, right? That's where you want to argue. That's where we tend to debate things. And so please, if you've got opinions, come in, chime in, because after it goes through the app dev working group on maybe Wednesday, I hope to craft the PR, which I'll send out on the mailing list here.
Is this labels related to the previous proposal, or is this separate? And why is the namespace called app.kubernetes?
That's two things. They're complementary to each other, as it's seen, in how we're going to do it. One of the things in the app dev working group was we looked at multiple ways to handle things. Labels, and in this case, it's labels and annotations because we're actually using both and they've got slightly different purposes. With labels, you can query, but they're shorter. Annotations can be longer, but you can't query on them. So you can't put like a URL into a label because a label doesn't have enough space. But that works for an annotation. So there's things like that. But in many projects, if you go look at places like AWS, labels or tags or equivalent is a way to structure and put this information out there. It's patterns people are used to, and we could start putting this out and building on it today and using it today. In fact, things like Helm already use labels in how they do things, right? It's part of the best practices, it's useful information, and so this is kind of a way to kind of expand that to a broader set of folks and opportunities, while doing some more generic ones that are not necessarily Helm specific or something else specific to their cases, but kind of bringing that together. And so that was kind of the idea here, is things that would complement each other. Some things you'll have in the higher level app API that you wouldn't have here, like maybe a link to an icon, right? That's the kind of thing that you wouldn't necessarily put on every object that you'd have, but some things you'd have on more objects. And so they can complement each other, and I would expect this to evolve over time, depending on how people use it.
I have a question. So I see how the... Is there an echo? Good. I see how the two proposals are complementary, but from the standpoint of a user that hasn't been through all the conversations about the KEP and the working group and doesn't understand how we came to the decision, we should ask if it will seem confusing that there's two different ways to group resources. So I know both groups are rushing to get a solution, but it would be good to make sure we end up with something that's not confusing for future users.
Agreed. And with everything out here, we can delay doing a PR until we get more feedback on the other one to make sure they complement each other. It's not like we have to be in a hurry. It's okay to delay things. Lots of things around here get delayed for a while, and that's fine too.
I think that's okay, but I kind of look at it as the application object being a may thing that people can opt into, and the labels being a should thing that should be done. Does that make sense? Like, everyone's already using labels like this. Like, most of these things that are listed in the common labels and annotations proposal are annotations that I see in Helm charts or in KSonic created applications or in Kubernetes manifests that are just raw manifests, right? So I would think marching forward and getting consistency there on the annotations can happen prior to the application KEP, and that the application KEP should adopt the conventions that are accepted from the proposal for labels and annotation recommendations, in my mind.
From my standpoint, a good outcome from our users 2 quarters from now is that there's a single document that tells them, you know, whether they're a UI designer or an application author, all the things they may or should do in sort of a coherent language. So even if we have 2 separate proposals, at the end, we need to come up on the docs page with one document that says how to group your resources.
That makes sense, because we want one consistent direction for folks, where the may and should and how all that work comes together. It would be nice just to have, here is the different layers of things you can and should and do, and here is what you can get out of it by doing those things. And I don't know, maybe I'll delay the PR on the labels and annotations until we have a better idea where things are going to go with the app object, and just see how we can make a consistent, holistic approach to this that's easy to communicate, and so people understand it at the end of the day. And the different parts complement each other, and we can explain how.
One interesting thing I think we might get out of this is, in theory, something like Helm could actually generate the app resource based on the labels if they're done correctly here, and or it could actually test the application resource against the labels and say, okay, you have to describe what your application actually is, because the labels exist as we would expect them to. So I think there would be some interesting testing use cases, and also like automating the application resource as well would come out of making sure the two are complementary and understand each other.
All right, so back to opinions on this though. If you do have feedback or input on this, please get it in here because it will help. And back to the other proposal, if you've got feedback on the app object as well, please think it through, look at how you could or would use it so that they can get an alpha implementation working. Well, that's all I got.
Okay, so we only have 8 minutes left. Now, there's one topic left, and that's time zones and cron jobs. Do we feel like we have enough time to discuss this, or should we defer this to the next meeting?
I think we have enough time. That's basically either I want to foster more discussion around the topic. I've initially marked the feature for 1.10, so we'll be safe with whether this feature will get accepted or not. But my biggest worry is that, so here's the initial idea. There are requests to support time zones in cron jobs when you specify how your job is being scheduled. Until now, there's not a single object in the Kube API that actually supports time zones. And I was reluctant from the beginning, but I was kind of, since I was the only one, I felt like I'm not going to go against it. But currently, I feel that we will be somehow breaking the contract that the users might have against the Kube API, because none of the object is actually providing information with a time zone. So if we will support time zones in cron jobs, that means you will be giving users an opportunity to schedule jobs using time zones, but all the information that you will be actually getting from a cluster will always be without the time zone, which might lead to confusions with regards to when the job was scheduled, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my main questions. How others are feeling about the topic of supporting time zones in Kube API, especially that so far there are several problems when we want to inject time zones, and this might lead to some fragility in the controller when we will be supporting time zones in case of, I don't know, federated jobs or jobs that are triggering on multiple clusters in different zones. But like I said, my biggest worry is the fact that we are not supporting time zones anywhere else. None of the objects are actually letting users to choose time zone or present information. This is purely a client-side operation if you want to actually deal with time zones.
So is there anything else besides cron job that would really be maybe interested in time zones? What else do we have that is scheduled that you typically want to do time-based things on, right?
So I think one other thing is, if I remember this PR correctly, the larger issue and the pushback was on including the IANA database on all Kubernetes distributions as a default requirement.
Yeah, that will be another thing with regards to that.
And also the fact that time zones are kind of brittle and fungible, and they can change and break at random points in time, right?
Exactly. And add to that daylight saving time issues. So
leap seconds, the whole 9 yards, right? So
yeah, generally, if we do that, that might introduce a whole another area of problems that we will be struggling with instead of moving the problem on the client to be able to specify how to schedule the job so that it's properly running on the server.
So, what kind of outcome are you looking to get from this discussion in particular? Are you looking to get a decision on whether we should do this or not do this?
Yeah, pretty much, or at least start some discussion in what direction we want to go with it. And I'm personally leaning towards not including it. And I would like to hear from other folks what they think, comment on the PR or on the original issue. Both are linked in the agenda. What they think, whether we should allow it or should not, and what's the interest actually for the future. I haven't seen any major interest in that feature. That's why I'm leaning towards not including it at all.
So one thing I would say is that, and I don't have a strong opinion either way about whether this is included or not, but I'm not sure if SIG apps, so this is a decision that would fundamentally affect the definition of a Kubernetes distribution, like conformance on down. Because if we're saying now you have to be IANA compliant and include an IANA time zone database with your Kubernetes distribution, that might be something that we should take up with SIG. You'd want to take up with SIG architecture, because it's kind of beyond just the ecosystem around Kubernetes or the workloads controllers or apps itself. It's kind of a very major decision that you would want, I think, top level maintainer feedback if you were going to try to do it. And then I think we gave a brief summary of some of the issues that would surround doing that in terms of time zones can be somewhat brittle. Other than that, I mean, I don't really have anything else to add. So it would be great if other people who do have a strong opinion from SIG apps could chime in on it. And if you really think it's a great feature, maybe shout for it now so we can try to resolve it.
That's fair. I'll try to sync and bring the topic on the sync arc. Mailing list and then.
Yeah, you might want to bring it up to actual discussion. I just dropped in the SIG architecture meeting minutes and agenda into chat. SIG architecture every other week has basically office hours to bring topics like this up. And then if they don't have enough, they go and deal with other working things over there. And this week is an office hours. So if you want to bring it up, you can get it on the agenda for this Thursday. And it's at, I don't know how it works, but it's 8:30, it's 8:30 Pacific time is when the meeting is normally held. And if you get it on the agenda, you can discuss it then.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks very much for the link.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, it looks like we're out of time. Did anybody have anything else they wanted to bring up really quickly though? Okay, I'm going to take silence for consent to end the meeting. And thanks for coming out. Always great talking to you guys, and see you next week.
Thanks, bye.
Ciao.